Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you about my illness. When we were in North Carolina in '52, I became very ill. I couldn't walk. My knees were so sore all the time, and my hands were sore. I couldn't open and close my hands. And so they took me to the doctor, and the doctor said I had rheumatic fever. And my parents, never hearing of anything like this before, they called it rheumatic fever.
Romantic fever?
And it was rheumatic.
Rheumatic fever is what it was. And so we didn't know how serious it was. But they told me to stay in bed for 3 weeks and then come back to the doctor. They gave me medicine and stuff. Well, we were fixing to leave North Carolina at that time. That was just the week before we were supposed to leave. So when the week was up, the medication had taken control and I was able to walk again, and they thought I was just fine. I was well. So we headed for Oregon in an old 1938 Pontiac. And
How many kids at that time?
there was, oh dear, let's see, that was in '52. So there was 8 or 9 kids, I guess. And we were all piled into that 38 Pontiac.
Wow.
No, there wasn't that many. Let's see, Shirley was a baby at that time. So there was me and Eloise and Leo and Bill and Shirley. There was
How old
5
were
of
you?
us. I was 10 when that happened. So for 2 years I struggled with this stuff. 2.5 years, because I was almost 11, I guess, when we went back out. So, but I would never tell my parents that I was hurting or anything. I couldn't get up. When I'd go to bed at night, I slept with my sister, and we had a big bed, so she slept on one side of the bed and I on the other, and if I got on the side that I couldn't get up on, I was in trouble because I had to roll out of bed and pull myself up because I couldn't. Once I was still for a while, my joints wouldn't work. So this went on for a couple of years, and I kept it from my parents. I wouldn't tell them that I was sick or anything. And I'd make sure I got out of bed before anybody could see me. And when I'd sit down,
Why did you keep it
toward
quiet?
the end, when I'd sit down at school, I'd sit for a few hours and I couldn't get up. It'd take me the whole recess to get up and go to the restroom.
Brittany asked why you didn't want it or wouldn't tell your parents or
Because I thought they would put me in the hospital or something. I just didn't want to. So evidently I did go to the hospital when I was 13. They took me to see Dr. Oberg in Cottage Grove. And he told my dad I wouldn't live. So I spent 13 days in the hospital and went home and spent 3 months in bed. And they were always saying, that I couldn't live very long. Well, I made it through that. And when I had the same doctor for several years, and then when I was 17 and I met Overly, and when I told the doctor I was going to get married, he walked the floor. It wasn't him, it was a different doctor, Dr. Speece. He walked the floor and cussed at me, and he says, "You'll get married, and 6 months later you'll be pregnant and dead." And so I got through that, and I had 7 kids, and you guys all know how many foster kids we had and all that stuff. But I had rheumatic fever 2 more times in between that. When I was 32 years old, when Greta was born, I remember we just lived around the corner from, not very far from Safeway, and the doctor's office was right behind Safeway. So I walked over there to see the doctor one day, and he said, "Did you walk over here?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "That is too dangerous. You don't need to do that." He said, "You almost didn't make it through having this child." So anyway, when Greta was born, they tied my tubes. They said, no more babies because you can't live through having another one. Well, I lived through that, and then when I was 32, I come down with rheumatic fever again, really bad at that time. And I remember Charles Tuttle came over by the house, and he said, "I hear you're sick." And I said, "Yeah, I haven't been feeling too well," but I said, "I'm doing okay now." So anyway, I go to the doctor, and he says, "We're going to set up a schedule in Portland for you to have surgery, heart surgery." And that scared me half to death, because at that time my heart was so enlarged that I could hardly even get my breath. It was so heavy in there. And I had holes in the valves of my heart. So he said, "We're going to send you up for open heart surgery." And I said, "Well, do you think I could wait 3 months?" I don't know why I said 3 months, but I thought something would happen during that time maybe. So he said, "Well, I wouldn't wait very long, because the longer you wait, the less chance you have of making it." So 3 months later, I forgot about the surgery. I woke up one morning. That night I went home. And that night, you kids were all upstairs in bed. I went around and I'm praying, and tears were flying because I was so upset. I said, "Lord, what's gonna happen to all these kids if I die?" And I knew if I went under the knife, I would die. And my heart was still troubling me very bad at that time. So about a week later, I woke up one morning. I was sleeping on my left side, which I had never been able to do for years because my heart was so enlarged. And I got up and I moved my arm, and it didn't feel heavy in there. Nothing bothered me anymore. And I woke Overly up. We had just gotten a new king-size bedroom set. And Overly's laying way over on one side of the bed, and I was over on the other side. I yelled at him. I said, "Overly, wake up." I said, I woke up sleeping on my left side, and it didn't hurt. I said, "I think everything's okay." And he said, "Oh." So I go out and I buy myself a bicycle, and all the kids had bicycles, so we rode our bicycles together. I got a baseball bats and gloves and all that stuff, and we went out in the backyard and played baseball. And from that time on, I never had any problem with my heart. And I never went back to the doctor for that. I'd been to the doctor for several things over the years, but never for that. So we go back to North Carolina then in 2000. And now all this stuff happened back in the 70s and 80s. So in 2000 I go back to North Carolina, and I got bitten by a spider down on my ankle. So I go to see the doctor for that, and that's the first time I'd been there to that place since I was born there. I was born in Cherokee Hospital. So they wanted to update all my records and stuff, so I had to fill out all these papers, and when they seen I had rheumatic fever, they had to pull out their machine and start testing me. So they tested and tested and tested and didn't find anything wrong. They did find a small, tiny little, just a little pinhole in the valve of my heart, and they said that didn't cause any problem at all. So They even sent me to Asheville. And I went through all them machines and everything. Ended up, for several years I went through. Every time I'd go to the doctor, they'd want to send me in for tests to see if I was okay. And then I had what they told me was a heart attack, because I guess it was just exhaustion myself. I don't know. But anyway, I reached over, I was setting a cup of coffee down for Overly one day. This was in, on 5th Street in,
That was in Marion,
In
wasn't
Marion.
it? That was in Marion, yeah.
after we'd moved to Marion. That was in
On Clark Street.
2006, 2006,
Clark
I think.
Street.
5 or 6. Anyway,
I think it was 2008, it was right after we had gone to Scotland.
well, it
Anyway,
may have been
yeah.
8. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was. It was in 2008, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
That's okay.
And then I collapsed when I set the
Mhm.
coffee cup down. And I said, I can't get up, Norman. And so Norman thought I was just joking around. And he said, I'll help you. And so he gets hold of my arm, and I just kept going down, down, down. He had to carry me over to the couch. He called the ambulance, and they took me in, and they told me I'd had a heart attack. I spent a couple of days in the hospital, and they sent me to Asheville, and went through all this stuff, tested me, give me a stress test and everything. And so here 3 doctors are, a few days later, standing around where I was on this gurney, and he said, what do you attribute this to? He said, we can't find any evidence of a heart attack. He said, we thought we had evidence of heart attack. I said, we can't find any evidence of heart attack, and your heart is fine. And so from that time to this, I've never had any more problems with my heart.
Awesome.
So, and I'm 76 years old.
I think that guardian angel's still watching over us.
So, that was my story with
Being sick. Telling us about when you were growing up and the type of work Grandpa did and how he almost got y'all into some trouble.
Okay, after the twins died, my mom got scarlet fever. So she was not in good health at all. So the doctors told her that she had to go, she needed to get out of the house. And she went out and got a job. So this, we had a neighbor that lived up above us, that Lila Dockery was her name, and she was one of Mom's good friends, and she'd come down, visit all the time. And the landlady, where we had moved to, her and her husband just all of a sudden decided to move back in with us. They had gone away when we moved into the house. They moved to Florida. And so all of a sudden they came back and they had decided they were going to be there. And so she was, every day she would say things about my mom. They stayed in the house with us for a while. And she would say bad things about Mom. And I was only 5 years old, but I took offense to that. So one day she called my mom an old heifer. And I told Mom that. So when Mom gets home from work, this lady, Mrs. Patterson was her name, and she was up trying to fix up the house that they were going to move in. So Mom goes out and meets her up by the barn. She wasn't going to have her come down where us kids were. And she confronted her with it. And of course Dad was there watching, and he didn't know what to do because Mom was really upset, and my mom never did get upset about things usually. So this old lady said something to her real smart, and she just took her hand and slapped her against the barn.
My time is grandma.
She was a little woman too.
I'm
So
not
we-
surprised at all.
We
That's where
decided,
the Tilley women get it.
Yeah.
we decided to, I'd never seen my mom angry like that. So we decided, Mom and Dad took us kids, and we went up to Lila's house, which was just up above where we were at, and made a plan. And so we walked across the mountain to the Murphy area, and that's where we settled down. We went to my aunt's house, Aunt Nina Killian. We went to her house and spent the night or two, and then we we decided to move into my dad's an old house that they had way up on the head, we called it the head of Owl Creek. So we move into that. I mean, it was like 8 miles from town, and you had to walk about 1.5 miles into the house because you couldn't get a car up in there.
Was that the house you showed me? Off of
No,
Hanging Mountain?
I've never had any pictures of that house. That was
That's
when I
not
was
the one
5.
that.
That was on Owl Creek.
Yeah.
And that was, now Uncle Robert, he lived there on Owl Creek. And so from there, well, while we were there, I'll tell you a little story that happened. My Uncle Claude came over to visit my aunt, Toots, Mama's younger sister, who was staying with us. And Claude came to visit, and my dad was working away from home. So we go to church one night. They were having a revival. And that's when my Aunt Toots became a Christian. So we walked home. We walked to church, which was 1 mile away from home, and back home. And my uncle decided he was going to go to the restroom before he went home. Well, we lived so far out in the boonies, and there was nothing but outhouses in those days. We had no electricity. We used oil lamps. And he decided to go to the toilet. So he goes, and he's gone, and he's gone, and he's gone, and there's just my mom and her sister there, with us 3 little kids. And after a while, my little brother was only like 2.5 or 3 years old at that time. He was 3, I guess. So they sent him out to check on Bob. Well, Mom and Toots forgot to tell him that there was a loose board in the bottom of the toilet.
No.
So he had gone in there in the dark, and he fell in the toilet.
Oh.
So he couldn't come back in the house. So he had to go to the creek and jump in. Good thing it was not middle of winter. And
Oh my goodness.
so that's how my Uncle Claude and Aunt Toots got together. So during that time, my dad, he was working at a mill in Murphy, and making like $1 an hour, $1.50 an hour, something like that. So it wasn't enough to keep his family going, and he decided he would make himself some liquor and sell it. So here I am, 5 years, well, I wasn't 5 at that time. At that time I was about 6. So I can remember holding the aluminum, he used those copper, I guess it was, copper. He would make copper hoses to run the stuff through, and he built this big round steel, and I would hold it for him, because he did it right by the kitchen stove, and he had to have the soldering iron. He had to keep it hot all the time, and he'd solder this stuff too with they did everything really backwoodsy back in those days. Nobody probably knows what solder is these days. It's just like a glue, only you put it on with hot iron. And so I helped him build his still. Never did get to see that still for a long, long time. After we moved, a little bit later, he bought this farm, a 120-acre farm, and this still was on that property. So when I was about 8 and a half, the revenuers came in. We saw all this string of cars coming up the road, and well, they didn't drive past our house because the pasture was right out here in front of the house, and there was a gate and everything, so they didn't try to drive up to it. But they had parked their cars below our house. I was out on the back porch, me and my sister Eloise, and we saw them coming. We told Mom and Dad there's cars coming up the road, and we hadn't been used to that because we didn't have a car at that time. So they get out, and there's people with cameras and all this stuff, and they walked right by our house. So Dad had some of his whiskey stored in the extra bedroom. He had Mom hand it out to him. He took it up on the hill and hid it. Well, nobody knew that belonged to him. Nobody had any idea who it belonged to. But he was so upset, he found out that his best friend, whose name was Willard Capehart, came along and found, he was hunting, and he found that still. So he reported it. And Dad thought he knew it was his. He didn't know. So he gets his gun, and he goes out looking for Willard. So he walks across the mountain to my aunt, over to the other side of, over where we used to live before that, where my aunt and uncle or aunts lived over there. And so he went over, and on the way he met this guy by the name of Richard Hass, who was his stepsister's son, and he had left North Carolina and moved to South Carolina, I think, or maybe Ohio, someplace in there, and he became a minister while he was gone. So he met my dad in the middle of the road carrying this gun, and he asked him what he was doing, and he told him that he was going to go kill Willard because he had turned his still in. He couldn't believe his best friend had done that to him. So Richard started talking to him about Jesus. And the longer he talked, the more convicted my dad got, and pretty soon he's down on his knees right there in the middle of this old dirt road and committed his heart to the Lord. He come home carrying his gun, crying like a baby. Put his arm around Mom, and he was telling her what happened. He'd met Jesus and all that stuff. And so me and my sister couldn't hear what he was saying, and we were scared to death. We were hanging back on the porch just watching to see, because we thought a few months before that my grandpa MacDonald had passed away. And Dad had come home from work and told Mom, and I can remember her falling over on the bed and crying and all that stuff. And I thought that was what had happened there, that my grandmother had died. So me and Eloise are just huddling together, crying our eyes out. After a while, he gets us by the hand, and Mom gets Leo by the hand, and he takes us up to the apple orchard, which was, we had this little trail around by the house, above the house, which took us to the spring where we carried our water from, and had a spring box out there and everything, and then the apple orchard was right above it. So we go out there, and he has us all sit down around under the apple tree, and we're eating apples, and he tells us about what he was doing and how he met Jesus on the way. So from there on, my dad was a different person. So he, a few months later, or not long after, maybe a month or two later, his brothers were going to Oregon, so he decided he would go with them. But in the meantime, they were hauling this steel all over Murphy, showing it off. They didn't know who it belonged to.
The authorities were doing
Yes,
that?
the sheriff's department was doing that. And, but they were talking about what a good job that the person had done on that still. And nobody ever knew that it was his. So consequently, that was in 1948, and his brothers were moving to Oregon, so he decided to get in and go with them and get a job because they told him he could get a really good job out there. Is it time yet?
Good.
So, he goes out with them, and 6 weeks later, he sent money for us to come on the train to Oregon. And we get on the train, well, actually, we go to Murphy and ride the bus. I had never been out of Murphy that I remember, to go anywhere after I got big enough to remember. So we ride the bus to Chattanooga and get on the train and head for Oregon. And what a ride it was. My little brother was so wild. He was 3.5 years old when we So he'd go in the bathroom and he'd lock the door. And then at each stop, the porter had to come and check the bathrooms out to see that nobody was in there, because you couldn't be in the restroom when the train stopped, because somebody could get injured, so you had to be in your seat. So one day, one stop there, the porter came by as a great big old guy, and tried to open the door to the restroom, and it wouldn't open, and Leo said, everybody all over the car heard him yelling, "You can't come in here, I got my britches off." Okay, Leo came out of the restroom, and he's climbing all over the seats and everything, and one of the ladies that was sitting on the other side of my mother turned around to her and said, because Mom had told her we're from Murphy, and she said, well, your daughters, they are very well behaved, but he is very backwoodsy. And so Mom was embarrassed at that, but anyway, we go on to Chicago. That was our first layover. And the first thing I saw was this neatly dressed lady sitting on one of the benches. And she noticed us right off. It was like she was there to help us. So she, every time Mom needed to take one of us to the restroom or whatever, then she was right there to help her. So she took us over to this restroom. We had to climb up some steps to get into this restroom. It was across the way from the terminal. So then she's gone. She disappeared. Well, me and my sister went into these two restrooms, and they had the stalls there, you know. So when we came out, there was no Mom and there was no Leo. And we looked around and we never did see them, because it was a really big place. And so we're both crying by the time after we couldn't find them, and we thought we'd go back over to the station, try to find our way back over there, and on the way, this little lady met us. And she took us by the hand and said, I'll help you find your mom. Because we were bawling our eyes out. And so we go back in, and there's Mom washing her hands at the sink. And she helped her get us back over there. So we go on to Oregon. Well, I never thought about that I'll jump ahead just a little bit. I never thought about that anymore for many years. And back in the 1980s, I don't know, somewhere around 1986, I get this knock on the door one day. And I had a pie shop in my home at that time. This lady knocked on the door, and I opened the door, and she was very nicely dressed, just plain, you know, everything was plain, but it was just like she kind of almost glowed because she was so clean, and so every hair was in place and everything. And she just looked at me and she said, "I'm hungry." And I said, "Well, you come right in." I had just made some apple pie. And I got her a piece of pie, and she sat down and ate that and drank something. And then she gets up and says, "I gotta go." And I took her plate to the sink and started to follow her out, and she was no longer there. And I knew something was strange about it, so I go all the way. We lived in one of the busiest areas of Cottage Grove, right in front of the post office, and the community college was next door to us. And I walk down my steps and look up and down the street, nobody in sight. There's nobody around. So I just go back in the house, and I'm pondering this lady coming in, and I didn't know who she was or where she went. And then it was much later that I got to thinking about it. She looked just like the lady at the train depot in Chicago. So I always said she must have been my guardian angel, because she looked just like her, and she just came and ate and left. I mean, she didn't look like she was just.
Did she still look young?
No,
Yeah.
I mean, she wasn't a young, young
But
person,
she
but
wasn't
was just
any
a
older.
No,
Wow.
and dressed just like she was.
Interesting.
So
Wow.
I always said that was my guardian angel.
We entertain angels everywhere, huh?
So, because I never knew where she went. I mean, she didn't have time to get in a car and go. I just stuck the stuff in the sink, and I went back to follow her out, and she was gone. And there was 7 steps to the steps there on 5th Street. So she had to go down a flight of steps, and then she would have had to get in her car and go. There was no cars in sight. There was a few parked cars here and there, but nobody around.
That's awesome.
And so, anyway, we go back to the train. We get into Portland, Oregon, and that's where my dad was supposed to meet us. And of course, this is all strange to us because we'd never been to big cities or anything before that. So Dad was there to meet us at 10 o'clock in the morning when we got in. At 10 o'clock that night, we're still sitting there waiting for him. All day long, he searched for us
Oh, man.
because he didn't know us. Us kids, Mom had us over in the corner, kind of, but she had never had her hair cut. And just before we left, her sister had cut her hair and put a perm in it. So my dad didn't know my mom.
Oh my God.
I mean, he would have, if he'd been up close to her, but he just didn't
looking
see.
for what
He
he-
walked past us many times, I guess, and we were waiting for him to come and get us. We didn't know what to do. And there was no telephones or anything during those days, and nobody carried a phone. So
That had to be a scary
that
day.
late that night, we got home about 10 o'clock that night. And
How did he finally recognize you? How did he finally recognize you?
Or did you guys see him?
Mom happened to walk over she was gonna go try to check with some authorities there anyway, trying to find somebody, and she happened to walk right by him. He's walking down looking, trying to find her, and she just reached out and got a hold of him, and he turned around like he was gonna hit her, He thought somebody was trying to pick his pockets or something, because she just reached out and got hold of his back pocket. And so he took us back over to Diston, Oregon. He had a house all set up for us, and we'd go there as across the river. We had to walk across this little river on a swinging bridge. We went across there, and so that's where we lived in our first house at Diston. And he was working for the first time in his life. He was making good money. He was making he went from making $1.50 an hour to making $110 a day.
Oh, wow, that was
So-
good for back then.
Yes, it was.
Wow.
Rich.
So that was our first episode in North Carolina. I mean,
And
in
you made it
Oregon,
with all
from
those
North
kids.
Carolina to Oregon. And let me see.
How
From
long
there-
did you stay that time? I mean, did you?
Oh, we lived there for 2 years. And Dad thought he'd made enough money to make it for a long time on his farm, because we raised everything we ate there on the farm, you know. And so we just left everything just like it was, furniture and everything. It had a crib to keep all the corn and stuff in, right down below the house, and we had a barn, and we had a big pasture, and
That's in
a
North
chicken
Carolina.
in North Carolina, and a chicken coop all right over inside the pasture area. And my sister and I used to go out, and we had a pig pen where he raised his pigs, and that's in the fall of the year they would kill the pigs and cure the meat. They'd smoke it, and the only thing we'd go to the store for back there was to get the sugar and flour and lard. So, and in fact, Mom rendered most of the lard that we had from the pigs. So everybody used that kind of, lard back in those days. That was how they seasoned their food with. So, and he'd buy pinto beans sometimes at the store, but he'd go once a month to the store, and that was it. But we raised everything else in the garden. But we went back to North Carolina in 1950, I guess it was 1951. And then in 52, we turned around and went back to Oregon, and that's where
Wow.
we were
That's
raised.
a lot of traveling.
Yeah, because we just could not make it there. He didn't think, so he sold his farm, 120 acres, for $600 to his brother. And he also owned 38 acres of property, who he sold to another brother. And they
And
built
y'all
their,
would have been totally rich by.
oh, I know. So anyway, we were raised up there in Oregon then. And then when Ophelia came along, we got married, and we got married in the little church at Diston. And now when we moved there was no church there. But that when we first moved out there, and then in the mid-50s they built a church there, and it's called the Full Gospel Fellowship, and the pastor's name was Barney Dodd. And, so that's when Ophelia came up to see him, and we met, and we got married there. Went to California. That was my first experience in San Francisco.
You went there like on a
I went on my
honeymoon, or
honeymoon
you
to
were moving
California.
there? Okay.
And going through Oakland
It's a lot different now, I guarantee.
was terrible.
Yeah.
Back then also.
It took all afternoon to get through. Is it Oakland? That's the one, yeah.
Right by
Just
San
before-
Francisco, yeah.
Yeah. And then his mom lived not far from Oakland there. And she had had a little restaurant at San Jose, I believe it was. So we had to visit all those places. And then we went to San Francisco. And he was so happy to get to go to San Francisco. didn't interest me at all. So I sat in the car most of the time.
Oh,
And we spent that day in San Francisco, and then went. I guess we were in California about a week, and went back to Oregon. And a week later he worked for the Forest Service, and they were sending him to Eastern Oregon. So he goes over there, and he's gone a month, and then he comes back and gets me, and I go to Eastern Oregon. So that was my first experience in Eastern Oregon, and that was something else. We lived in this, what they call guardhouse.
He was a lineman, wasn't he?
He worked for the Forest Service. Well, I don't know what his title was. They surveyed and all that
Yeah, I
kind of
think he
stuff.
told me he was a lineman, and he had to go around and
Yeah,
check stations
yeah.
and stuff.
We weren't there too long until they transferred him back to Diston.
He told me a story when he was there, and he said that he was out with his boss or one of the other linemen, and they gave him some chewing tobacco. You remember that story? He told me about
Told
him.
me that.
Yeah, he said so. So he took some chewing tobacco, and he didn't know he was supposed to spit it. He started swallowing it. And so he's swallowing it, and he just gets really sick, and they're crossing over a river, and he gets sick, and then he said that he carried a pistol, a .22 pistol, and he said that that a bear came out of the tree line, and his friend had a little .22 rifle as well, and they knew if they shoot the bear, it'll only make it mad. So the bear came at him, and they would climb the tree, and then the bear finally left. And he said he was sick the whole time. Yeah. So he said he's never had tobacco again.
We got married in 1956, and in 1957 we headed for Arkansas. My husband thought he had to go back there and do some ministry stuff, so I had never driven before. I had got behind a wheel a few times, but when I was younger, but I did not know how to drive. So on the way to Arkansas, my husband got very, very sick, and he was laying in the back seat of the car, and I was driving. I drove through Arizona. I drove through all the way from California to Arkansas, just about. I drove myself. He drove a little bit. Anyway, on the way to Arkansas, the car breaks down in Arizona, way out in the middle of the desert. They didn't have the big freeways like they have today, just a 2-lane highway. And we break down. The timing gear went out on this old 1949 Chevy we had. And for 3 days in August, we sat out there on the desert before we could get the car all fixed up and ready to go. And most of that time, he's out hitchhiking back and forth trying to find parts for the car and all that stuff. And so he met this fellow in the town close, I'm not quite sure what town it was in Arkansas, in Arizona, but anyway, he met him wherever it was at. It was on Highway 99, I thought. as we went through. So he got, met this guy who had broken down, and he was going to a job in California, and he had his wife and child with him, and he couldn't get them back home, so, because his car had broken down, and he was going on to his job in California. So he said that he would, fix the car for us if they would, if we would take his wife back to Muskogee, Oklahoma. So that's what we did, so I got to go to Muskogee.
Mm-hmm.
So when they came out with that song about Muskogee,
You knew you'd been there.
an Okie from Muskogee, you know, I knew I had been there. So anyway, we get back to Arkansas.
Mom, when the car broke down and you said Dad was hitchhiking back and forth, so you spent a good
I
portion of the
spent-
time sitting at the car by
In the
yourself
heat.
in the heat in August,
It was hot.
which is.
And I
which
said,
is-
I'll never
Yeah.
live in Arizona. Do not want to live in Arizona.
And here you've been for the last almost 2 years.
So, I never did come back to Oklahoma. Well, I've been through Arizona many times, and my sister lived here for a while. I'd stop and see her, but never wanted to live in Arizona.
Sister.
Dolores. And then we moved back to Arkansas, and we lived a year with his grandparents. They had a big farm, and they were 75 years old at that time, and they were not able to do the farming, so they asked Oakley if we'd stay with them and farm for him. So we did, and Oakley plowed the fields for him and plant and took care of all that stuff. And I thought I had died and gone to the place below, because it was 10 times worse than any place I'd ever lived before. But that was the first little while I was there. After I'd been there a while, it was home, and I loved it. And we lived there. We had 6 of the 7 children there. Then we moved back to Oregon, and that's where I raised the kids. In Oregon, where we raised the kids. We had a restaurant, and a little restaurant on Main Street at one time. And Ron, you had a little story about that?
And I told this at Dad's funeral, but I know a few of you haven't heard this story, but when I was 13, they owned the restaurant in Main Street in Cottage Grove, and I used to go there every night and help them mop and clean up and stuff about 7:30. And one night it's pouring down rain, and we're cleaning up, and Mom's cleaned the grill, or Dad's cleaned the grill, and Mom's helping clean, and I'm mopping the floor, and somebody knocks on the door. And Mom goes to the door and opens it up, and it's a family. I don't know how many kids they had, but a husband and wife and maybe 5 kids. And they said they'd broken down on the freeway, I-5, and asked if we could help. And Mom fires up the grill and cooks them all dinner and feeds them. And they said they were trying to get up to Diston, which was about 20 miles out of town. And so I'm sitting there at the counter with the dad, and my dad's standing behind the counter, leaning over, just talking with him, and he's telling him how hard it's been trying to get to Diston, the car broke down, and blah, blah, blah. And my dad reaches around to the till and pulls out $20 and hands it to the man, and the man goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have any way to pay you back. I don't know when I can pay you back either." And Dad tells him a story about when he was 17 and he was hitchhiking across the country, and he winds up in Colorado, and he was broke and didn't have any money. It's pouring down rain, and some guy picked him up hitchhiking and stopped at a restaurant, fed him, and then afterwards gave him $20. And my dad said to him, let me get your address, and I'll mail you the money when I get a chance to." And the guy said, I don't want you to mail it back to me. all I ask is that you pass it on. And so then Dad tells him the story and looks at him and just says, I've passed this $20 on many times in my life, and all I'm asking you is to pass it on. And so that was my dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so that was a great lesson for a young teenager.
Yeah.
It's good.
And then Mom got in the car and drove him to Distant.
Are we taking a break? Step back. Keep going, Mama. What's
going.
next?
Okay.
Well, I don't.
Any funny stories about us as kids?
Like,
Funny stories
Be
about
careful
us.
though, we're all.
yeah. We're all here, but, well,
We probably have a ton of Norman stories.
Well, yes, I can tell you about the time
Tell
Norman
them
fell
all.
in the pig pen.
Okay.
oh, yeah, I remember that.
Okay.
I
All
remember
right,
that.
let's listen to
The
this.
time Norman fell in the pig
Yep.
pen. Yeah, I remember that.
We lived on Pitcher Lane there out of Cottage Grove. And Norman was wild. He was, how old was he at that
He
time?
was like-
10 or 11.
No, he
Yeah.
was like 12.
12, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
12 or 13, I think.
And
I was in
19 or
fifth, I was in
19.
fifth grade.
He was
So he
thinking
in
that he
seventh
was
grade or
getting
eighth grade.
getting too old to be told what to do, so he never ever followed instructions. So we were getting ready to go someplace one
To
day.
church.
To church, I guess it was, and he wasn't gonna go, I guess. And he crawls up on top of the pig pen and he's walking across the top and fell in, I guess.
And you made him go to church anyway.
No, I don't think he went that day.
No, he did, cause Ursula smelled him. And what happened to you? And he was so mad.
I remember he had rabbits, and
Yeah.
he had a rabbit pen.
Yeah.
And he and I used to have to look after the rabbits.
Yeah.
And he would always, we had the males in one pen and the females in the other, and he used to like to put the males in the female ones. So we had rabbits everywhere. By the time we left there, we didn't know what to do with all the rabbits. There was dozens of
Tons
rabbits.
of them.
And so Mom just said, let them loose. So we let them loose, and to this day, you can still go up Pitcher Lane and there's rabbits
Everywhere.
Mom, I'd like to hear about when you first met Dad.
Well, I was 17 years old, almost 18, when I met him. No, I was 17 and a half. He was 23. He had, and almost at his 24th birthday, and he decided to come up from Antioch, California is where his mom lived, and he lived with her at that time, so he came up to visit our pastor. And he came over to our house with the pastor, and I didn't pay any attention to him at that time. It didn't. I wasn't interested. So,
Be a Tilly girl thing.
Yeah.
so he, a couple of weeks later, maybe 2 weeks later, we had a church picnic at Regina Park out of Cottage Grove, Oregon. I went to that, and he walked up to me and started talking a little bit, and everybody started whispering, you know. So, about a week later, I knew that he was planning to, he was always trying to get around to talk to me, and I didn't want him to ask me out or anything, so I stayed behind my mom. And she always had, she had younger children, and she was taking care of them, so I just walked around behind her. So my uncle was close to Oakley's age, and they were good buddies, and they both were hanging out with the pastor. And my uncle said to him, "What do you think about that?" I was the secretary for the young people's group there. And I said, "What do you think about that secretary of the young people's group?" He said, "Well, I think she's a living doll." My uncle just about died. He carried that to the limit. Everybody in the community heard about it. So the next Sunday, Overly's following me around at church. And I'm staying as close as I can to my mom. And so we get to the door of the church and he catches up with me there. And he says, "Could I drive you home?" And I said, "Well, I guess so." And he just turned around to my uncle and held his hand out, and my uncle handed him the key and fell flat of his face in the floor because he didn't think anybody was going to take me home.
Didn't Dad kind of have a bet with him that he could get you to go home with them, and he said,
Well, he told him, Overly
That he
didn't have a
did.
car.
yeah.
So he told him that he could use his car. So he held out his hand, he put the key in his hand and fell flat of his face in the
Never
floor.
thought it would happen.
So he took me home. 2 weeks later, he asked me to marry him. And he was taking me home from church one Wednesday night. And when I got home, I mean, we were following Mom and Dad home from church, and when I got home, because he had Overly pulled over to the side of the road and asked me if I would marry him, and I didn't give him any answer. So we were 5 minutes late behind my dad getting home. My dad's standing in the doorway waiting for us when we got there. He said, "You get in there and get in bed." So my dad was very much against me going out with him for some reason. So about that time, my sister Dolores came along, or right after that. She was born in May, the end of May, so that gave me some time to make up my mind whether I was going to marry him or not, because I didn't go to church for a couple of weeks. And then when I saw him again, I had to give him an answer, and I told him yes, I'd marry him, and not knowing what he was going to do. So he went straight to my dad and wanted to know if he could have his daughter's hand, if he would let him have his daughter's hand in marriage. And boy, my dad came home and he wanted everybody to go to bed, you know, and he said to me, he said, "Wait." Him and Mom sat down and he said, "Come over here and sit down. Are you sure you want to marry that guy?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, I guess so." So he, they all accepted it, and that we were married. That he came up here, or up to Cottage Grove in April, and in September we got married.
So when was the picnic at Regina Park during
The
this time?
picnic at Regina Park was a couple of weeks after he got there, which was the
Is that
end.
before he asked you to marry him
That
or
was the
after?
end of April or the 1st of May, somewhere in there. It's somewhere in May.
Before he asked you to marry him or after?
Oh, you know, that was before. I didn't even know him at that time. I hadn't gone out with him or anything.
So is that why we grew up in Regina Park?
That was our favorite
Dad's
hangout.
favorite.
I did
that was
not know
always-
that. I
That was
did
always
not
our
know
favorite
that.
hangout.
No, I mean, we grew up in Regina Park. I mean,
Yeah.
we
Yeah,
had
camping and
camping, picnics.
Picnics, and
Every-
that's what everybody in Cottage Grove used the Regina Park.
But that's where we
Recreation.
did all of our family reunions, all of our family get-togethers.
We did.
I learned to throw horseshoes there. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Last year when I went there to visit, we had a big family reunion there.
Yeah, that seemed to be the annual thing, wasn't it, when we were out there?
I've been to several court and family reunions there
Oh, yeah.
too.
Now there's one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast.
Yeah.
They have the McDonald family reunion at Coiner Park in Cottage, or Murphy. North Carolina. And that's where my family's from.
And I've been to one of those.
Yeah.
I've been to one
Yeah,
of those.
I've been to
with
one
you.
too.
It's,
Now, how about before you got with Dad, and tell us a few stories about growing up and the moonshine still and all of that.
Oh, well, I can remember when I was 4 years old, we lived in this log house that my great uncle had built. It was almost a new home at that time, but it was really, back then it was nice. Had a fireplace and two bedrooms downstairs, and the upstairs was just wide open. I never did go upstairs, but it's me and Eloise. There was just the two of us, and we lived there until I was 5 when we moved from there. And I can remember some things that happened up there. And I could see my grandma going out to milk every night. Grandpa would first come up, and the pasture came right by our house, and he would go up and gather the cow and any other animals they had, and drive them back to the barn at night. And grandmother would take her bucket and go out and sit down and milk the cow. Every once in a while she'd let me try to milk for her. I didn't do too good job at that. But then we moved from there to a little area called Ebenezer, and lived there for a short time. And my twin sisters, in 1945, my twin sisters were born. They had diphtheria when they were born. Not diphtheria, yeah, that's what they said they had. And the lady that delivered them, the midwife, that told my mom that they wouldn't make it, I guess. So when one of them was 5 weeks old, I woke up in the middle of the night and the door was shut to our bedroom. Me and my sister had a bedroom next to Mom and Dad. I get up and I can hear movement around in the living room, so I open the door and look, and there Mom sits with a fire going, and she's just rocking back and forth crying, very quietly, but so I knew something was bad wrong. And so she told me that Dad had gone to get my grandmother and my aunt. And we had such an emotional funeral for that baby, and a week later I woke up to the same thing again. The other one died. She found him dead in the bed, both of them. So we had quite a time of it with going through that. So
How
from
old
the time,
were they when they?
They were 5 and 6 weeks old when they died. And my one of my relatives made the coffin, the cover for the coffin. I can still see that it was pink, all pink. And back then, the babies, when a person died, they didn't go to the funeral home. They kept them at home until time to bury them. So that was an emotional time in my life, and it set me against funerals. So anytime anybody in the area passed away, and I was invited to go to the funeral, or Mom and Dad was going, I would become very ill and I wouldn't get to go because I couldn't handle that. And and then here I go marry a minister later on, and I had to go to the funeral. We spent 10 years in Arkansas. Overly pastored the Free Will Baptist Church for a few years. Darla was little at that time, and she was the star of the show. We had a choir, and she thought she was the leader of the choir, so
And she still
when
does.
the choir leader would stand up to lead the singing, she would stand up and sing with him. She was about 1.5 years old. And she'd do his motions, he was always,
PK.
doing the music directions, and so, we spent a few years there, and then he, was invited to pastor this church. It was a Mennonite Brethren church, who they hadn't had a pastor for several years. It's just they call it a community church, so he pastored that church for 4.5 years, and most of the kids were, well, let's see, we had 5 children when we moved from there. It's Barren Hollow, and everybody in Arkansas called it Barn Holler.
Yep.
And we had a good time there. And then we moved from Arkansas to when Deanna was a baby. We moved from there. My dad came back and got us. Overly had gone on out to Oregon and found a job, and my dad and mom went on vacation to North Carolina, and they had a big station wagon, and they came by and picked us up, took us to Oregon. All the kids was sick and throwing up most of the way there, and then we lived in Oregon until the kids were all grown up. Greta was born there. She was born a year after we moved there. Oh, and I gotta tell you about this one little lady who decided, she always told me after Overly left, she was our next door neighbor, and she grew up with Overly when they were little. She thought he was her boyfriend. So when Overly left to go to Oregon, she said, "He'll be back." And I said, "No, he's not coming back. We're going out there. He'll be back." And so I was getting the idea she had to crush on him. And so about a year after, it was about a year after we moved out there. Greta was just a baby. She came to visit. Only she came to stay. I looked out one day and there's a taxi cab in front of my house. And I walk out on the porch and she's getting out, and her youngest son was with her. She had left her husband and 2 other kids at home. And she had come to get Overly. So she stayed for a little while. I didn't want to be rude to company, but after a while, I got a little mad. One day, Overly's upstairs sleeping, and she goes into the bedroom and takes her blouse off, and she says, "I hope Overly doesn't come down the stairs because I don't have my clothes on." And up the stairs she goes. I got her. And I sent her on her way.
What'd you say to her?
A lot of things, I can't remember.
I think she just got the fruit and kicked her off.
Any broken
Her
bones?
name was Idella Watts.
And her son was Benny, and he was my first crush, and my heart was broken when I came home from my slumber party and he was gone.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. First of many.
Yep, and then we lived in Oregon until 2000. And I left there and went back to North Carolina to take care of my mother. And she died in 2004. And then we moved to Asheville. And from there, we moved to Arizona again.
Where you said
And here I is.
It's been a
And,
great place to heal.
yes, it has.
and it's been wonderful. I have had a beautiful time here. The only problem I have is that the dust gets to me. And
Yeah.
even sitting here right now, I can feel it in my lungs.
You can hear it. You can hear it in your.
It's, the dust just kills me off. So, other than that, I have really enjoyed being here. I've been spoiled rotten by every one of my kids, and I can never express my appreciation enough to them. I love each and every one of them, and forever will.
And we
all
love you.
I'm gonna give you a hug and a
Love you
kiss.
too, Mom.
Aw.
Love you, Mom.
Love you too.
I'll get one side.
You bend it over?
Love you, Mama.
Love you too.
Just remember, babe, crack hill.
Yes.
Oh, Daylight wants to give a hug too.
Yes.
Oh, she is too cute.
Good kisses. Love you too. Thanks.
Come on, come on. Get in there.
ahead, Brittany.
I love you too, honey.
I'm a part of the generation.
That's right.
Good job,
Daughter loves
Becky.
you so much she pooped during it.
Again?
Yes.
Yeah, she was
Mike.
over here. Yeah, she was just over here.
Love you, Mom.
Love you too.
Say hi, Mariah. Oh, she was
I didn't say anything about
That's okay.
overly
Just was like that, so you
making everybody promise to take care of Mom.
Yes, he
He
did.
made everybody promise.
But you know what,
I
Mom?
know.
We didn't even have to promise. He didn't even have to ask us. We all would have
Well, I know that.
been right here.
Even the nurse came in. Oh, I should have told about when he passed on.
You go right ahead. There's time.
Is it
It's still
going?
running. It's still running.
When, about a week or so before he died, he told me that, Jesus was in the room. He said, I see Jesus. And I said, where's he at, honey? And he said, he's standing right over there in the doorway. And so I knew then that he was getting ready to go, because a lot of people, when they get ready to go, have visions or see, and sometimes I've heard of people saying Jesus came into the room where they were at, so I thought, well, he's ready to go. So the next time the nurse came, he made her promise to take care of me. He said, would you take care of her when I'm gone? And then he told her, he said, Jesus is here in the room. He said, he's right there in the doorway, and she just started crying. She just bawled her eyes out. But she was one of the best nurses, I'll tell you. She was a hospice nurse, and she took care of him through the whole year that he was home after he had this stroke. So he made Ron and Norman and Darla and everyone else, as far as I know, promised to take care of me when he was gone. And boy, have they taken care of me.